There's a reason a lot of urban legends originate around campfires. There's a lot that can go wrong when you stick a bunch of kids in a campground in the middle of the woods. As a camp counselor, it's my job to basically make sure these kids don't get lost or go off in their own. I mostly just make sure they follow the schedule. 7 a.m. wake up, 7:45 breakfast, 8:15 take them to their first activity, 10 a.m. snack, etc., etc. I'm basically a glorified babysitter. The kids are mostly alright. There's always a couple brown noses, a couple entitled brats who like to talk about mommy and daddy, a few hooligans. I like the quiet kids who always follow the rules. The hardest part of my job is nighttime. It gets harder to keep track of the kids, and they never seem to want to settle down for bed. Then they always want a campfire and s'mores and scary stories. Whoever thought it was a good idea to pump kids full of sugar and tell them scary stories to scare them into staying awake, and then send them off to bed is a real jerk. In order to make sure we don't lose anyone, camp counselors are constantly reminded to count their kids. I only have 7 kids this year. The organisers figure the smaller kid to counselor ratio, the better. So I start off my day with a roll call. Make sure no one is still in bed or sick. Count them before we leave. Count them at the first activity. You get the idea. I've got a pretty good group of kids this year, so I'll admit, I haven't always done my count when I should have. Still, I haven't lost a kid yet, so no harm, no foul. One night, the kids asked me to tell a campfire story. Normally, this is more easily done with a second person. You talk real low and soft, tell a story warning kids not to do something like wander off on their own or go swimming without supervision. Then, when you reach the most tense part of the story, your cohort will yell really loud and scare the crap out of the kids. They all scream, then they laugh. It works every time. When you don't have a second counselor though, it's a little tougher. It's always a little difficult coming up with stories all the time, so sometimes the counselors will get together and swap some stories. One particular night, the kids were asking for a story. They already had marshmallow and chocolate smeared all over their faces, so I obliged. This is the story of Clark Thompson. 30 years ago, young Clark came camping here with his father to this very campsite. They even used this very fire pit to cook their meals. Like you, Clark had s'mores almost every night before bed. He loved candy and sugar so much so that his father usually had to limit Clark to 2 s'mores a night. Some nights though, Clark would wait until his father was fast asleep, snoring loud enough to wake the dead, before sneaking out of his sleeping bag. He would go where they kept their food, a bucket strung up in a tree to keep it safe from bears. He would carefully untie the rope and lower the bucket, trying to make as little sound as possible. Clark would usually eat a couple marshmallows, some chocolate, never the graham crackers though. Those could never satisfy his sweet tooth. When he had eaten his fill, Clark would raise the bucket back up and tie it firmly in place before creeping back to bed. His father was none the wiser. One particular night, Clark snuck out of his sleeping bag for his midnight snack. The moon was so full that night and the stars were so bright he could see everything pretty clearly. Clark untied the bucket and brought down the snacks and dug in. After a while though, Clark had noticed he had eaten too much. Clark had eaten almost everything. All that remained were the crackers. Do you all know what happens if you eat too much sugar? A couple of the kids shouted out some answers. You get super hyper. My mum says I bounce off the walls. Boing! My mum says I talk really loud. My mum says I'm annoying. One of the quieter kids whispered, You get a stomachache. I nodded. That's right, you get a stomachache. And that's what happened to Clark. He ate so much he started to feel sick. So Clark decided to go for a walk. Maybe a little exercise would make him feel better. Since the moon was so bright, he didn't bother to bring his flashlight. He figured he would be able to find his way back without a problem. After all, he and his father came camping here all the time. He knew this forest like the back of his hand. So Clark set off, following a trail he knew pretty well. But after a little while, he started to feel worse. The pain in his stomach was so sharp he had to stop walking. Suddenly, he bent over and started to throw up. Ew! At the mention of puke, all the kids chimed their disgust in unison, and a few started giggling. When he was done, he noticed something weird. Maybe it was something shiny. Maybe it was an animal. But whatever it was, it led Clark off the trail and further into the woods. Now, what do we always tell you when we go on hikes? Always follow the path. The kids sounded like robots reciting the rule. Right. So eventually, Clark realized his mistake. He tried to turn around and go back to the path, but he couldn't find his way. Nothing looked familiar to him. Without any obvious landmarks to lead him back to his camp, Clark did what anyone would do. He called for help. He must have been too far from his camp for his father to hear him, though. But something else heard him. No one knows what happened to poor Clark, just that they found him in the morning. Or what was left of him. What happened to him? The fire was starting to die down, so it was getting harder to see the kids. It was time to wrap up the story and send them to bed. Some say it was a bear, some say it was Bigfoot, some say it was a psychotic cannibal. But what was left of him was a mangled mess. He was missing a foot and an arm, his guts spilled all around him. His bones were picked clean. The kids sat in silence for a while, digesting the story. Maybe it was a little too heavy for a bedtime story. All right, let's clean up and off to bed. It was a little awkward, but the damage was already done. The kids cleaned up their trash and put the candy away in silence. I was starting to feel a little guilty. I hoped some of them would be able to sleep. As they all filed off towards their tents, I did a quick head count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I counted 8 children, not 7. To the left of the dimming fire, someone was still seated. Something didn't seem right about him. One of his legs ended too soon, and one arm ended right at the shoulder. At one of the feet, a dark liquid had started to pool.